Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture. Albion Never Dies. This is part 2, looking at the British in Cyprus. And first of all, if you haven't listened to part 1, or if you've forgotten most of what I said, don't worry. These are all designed as kind of standalone or semi-standalone episodes, a bit like the Bond films. You can watch them in any order. These episodes you can listen to in any order. Hopefully if you have listened to, then this will build upon it, but if you haven't, it will still be fine. I'm talking, as I said, about the British in Cyprus, mainly because this is one of the most requested topics, or at least the British Empire is. Now is an interesting time to be looking at it, especially when curriculums around the world are looking at decolonialising their works. In fact, I work for an academic publisher, and at the moment, the bigwigs are talking about decolonialising, are offering, and perhaps slapping warning labels on old books that don't conform to modern ideas. There's a very common idea, which I first really came across when I did my undergraduate degree, the idea that European empires rode roughshod over local ideas. They went out there, just told them what to do, didn't pay any attention to local ideas, beliefs, borders, anything of the kind, and just slapped down different ideas upon them. And this really goes to, say, some criticism by Edward Said, the Egyptian, who wrote Orientalism, heavily criticised even the academics and their role in empire, which has become kind of taken as read, that's it, that's right. The fact that there were replies at the time, as with any academic idea, there's always some back and forth, and one of the most prominent Orientalists, Arnold J. Toynbee, actually agreed with some of the criticism and said what Said was saying was actually criticism of bad Orientalism, and did have some replies. I won't go too far into that is a very academic argument, but I do worry that some of the good has been thrown out with the bad. For example, the study of language. So even though we live in a very globalised world, the study of languages, especially in the UK, has gone down and down, to the point that when I did my undergraduate degree, I was initially attracted to the university because I had a really good language department, and it got closed down whilst I was there. Again, just due to lack of demand among British people. Of course, London has the largest Hindi library in the world outside India, because generations of Brits studied Hindi, and in fact, during Queen Victoria's Jubilee, back in the late 19th century, there were banners across the streets of London in both English and Hindi, and you can read about that in Jan Morris's trilogy of books on the British Empire. So I think there is some good that has been lost, but why? Why? And why were the Imperialists so interested? Were they so interested? This all gets into kind of my kind of dissonance, as I say, because obviously I've worked in academia for a long time, but my teenage years were spent in Cyprus. That's why this was my kind of first point to look at. And when I went to Cyprus at the turn of the millennium, just after, there were still some of the old ex-colonial officials out there, including one fellow I met who had helped draft the constitutions of 3 African countries, and he had an immense love and knowledge and interest in these countries and Africa as a whole, and actually had a depth of understanding I only came across once, rarely, from anyone else, and that was when I met the head of Africa section for Chatham House, a non-governmental organisation that helps advise the government. However, I would say that the ex-colonial fella actually had the edge, because he actually lived out there for much longer periods of time, not just going out for conferences or studies or things like that. He spent a long time out in Africa. And of course, if you live in a country, you tend to get very, very interested in it, and that's my own experience, right? So I lived in Turkish Cyprus 7 years, I lived in China for 6 years, and, you know, if you live there, you get interested in the local culture. In fact, one of my problems sometimes in China, meeting up with other expats in China, was talking about anything other than China, because they were so focused on, you know, the HSK exams. They were improving their Chinese language and getting qualified for it, and learning all about, you know, Chinese history, Chinese food, Chinese anything. All they wanted to do was learn about China, because of course they'd made the choice to go out there to a place which has, you know, the great firewall of China. It can be very difficult to communicate from China to other countries. Of course, there's workarounds, and lots of people have commented to me, if they know about them, oh, but surely you could have done this. And the reality is, they just didn't work that well. It is by design. difficult and at times controlled. So you are in a in a little bubble, a China bubble. And for me, I was very happy to start this podcast when I was in China to get an interest apart from that, and to talk to Chinese friends who are obviously not exclusively interested in China. They have other interests. So, as I say, one of the flaws of the expats in China was they got very, very, very interested in China, and that's something in Kipling's writing he talks about British officials in India who get really obsessed with odd corners of Indian history, driving the other colonials up the wall with their bee in their bonnet that they have about these Mongols and Rajas and so on. But it is an observed phenomenon over the centuries, and Turkish Cyprus was relatively open to the world except through lack of infrastructure 20 years ago. I've just been on a holiday kind of back home, and it was wonderful to see how much more developed it was, and in fact, I've seen the UK kind of suffer with the COVID time, and the USA seemed to have a bit of a dip. China certainly. Turkish Cyprus is doing phenomenally well. They've done fantastically well over the last 5 years. Some of their tourist places were popping. Mainly domestic tourism. But I was actually really, really impressed. But certainly 20 years ago is much, 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 much less developed. And of course, that's all to do with your connections. You don't have the option to replicate your life in the UK in another country if there's not the wherewithal to do it. Of course, there are sometimes, British expats and international expats in Shanghai are sometimes criticised within the China kind of community as a whole for trying to replicate their lives too much. But even there, you live under the same sun, you eat the same food, you're going to the same places as the locals, you have no choice. So you have to be interested. But as I say, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 100 years ago, you want to read the English news, well, the newspaper gets printed in London, it gets sent out by steamer ship, and it just takes a long time to get to you. So it's very, very difficult to replicate your English life in another country. You just end up living out there as you have to live out there. And even when my father was at school, and there was a boy at his boarding school, Eltham, whose parents were missionaries in the South Seas, I think, and by the time he wrote a letter saying, I'm feeling terribly unwell, by the time I got to his parents, and they wrote a letter back saying, I hope you feel better, and he'd long since forgotten about the illness. So I say communication being so much less or so much slower historically means that you don't really have a choice but to get thoroughly stuck in. Anyway, that is really the theme of this episode. There's an American friend who said to me a couple of years ago that overkill is underrated, so if I'm going to make this point, I shall make it thoroughly. And again, I'm going to have a look at the experience of Sir Charles William James Orr, because he wrote the book Cyprus Under British Rule, published well over 100 years ago, now out of copyright in the UK, so I'm very happy to read through it. I thought I'd say a little bit more about him, who he is, before I dive into the reading, which I think really shows his passion and his interest in the places he's being sent to. So, first of all, Charles William James Orr, C.W.J, or as I'll refer to him from now on, was born on the 20th of September 1870, and he was a British colonial administrator, born the youngest son of Major Andrew Orr of Londonderry, and educated at Bath College and the Royal Military College, Woolwich. His elder sister was a renowned astronomer, Mary Orr, but C.W.J. Orr was himself commissioned into the British Army, the Royal Garrison Artillery, as a second lieutenant, 15th of February 1889. The wonderful thing about him being in the army is, of course, there's plenty of documentation to talk all about his progress. We know he was promoted to lieutenant on the 15th of February 1892, served in British India, promoted to captain on the 7th of September 1899. Following the outbreak of the Second Boer War later that year, the Boer Wars were wars that my family served in at the time. Later that year, in March 1900, he was seconded for service in South Africa and was promoted to the rank of major as his father. Funny enough, my father was a major and his father was a major. I just did the University Royal Naval Units. In 1903, C.W.J. Orr became the British resident in northern Nigeria. And from 1911 to 1917 he was Chief Secretary to the government of Cyprus, which of course precipitated him writing this book. And later on was Colonial Secretary of Gibraltar, which is something I'll be doing an episode on a little bit later. And he was made a CMG in 1921. I've talked about the British Honour System before. The CMG, the Cross of St Michael and St George, or if you watch Yes Minister, CMG stands for Call Me God. He served as Governor of the Bahamas 1927 to 1932 and was knighted KCMG in 1928. KCMG, of course, Knight Commander of the Order of St Michael and St George, or alternatively, Kindly Call Me God. He wrote two well-received books, The Making of Northern Nigeria, of course based on his experience there, and Cyprus Under British Rule. So interestingly, his daughter Lettice, unusual name, married Sir Alan Lane, founder of Penguin Books, becoming Lady Letitia Lucy Lane. I suspect lettuce is actually a typo in my notes. But anyway, a very lively life, a very interesting life, travelling around the world, but again, spending the years out there, which was much more common at the time. When I lived in Cyprus, we occasionally got UN officials who, they came out for, a year or less, and normally because they were there for such a short time, you'd see them making the same initial mistakes, you'd see them coming to the same kind of initial conclusions, and then it would all get reset with the next fella coming out, and then the next fella coming out, and then the next fella coming out, and none of them ever really penetrated anywhere deep. I feel the time frames of the colonial circuit made a lot more sense if you're actually getting into it. Again, I'm really kind of attacking this point that colonial officials, they really weren't interested in the lives of the local people. Anyway, I probably made that point, but I'm going to keep on making it. I am going to look at chapter 2 of his book Cyprus Under British Rule, which is called History to the British Occupation. I like, first of all, that he embraces the word occupation, and second of all, this is a whole chapter not about the British in Cyprus, but about the background to it, and I think really shows his interest. It shows an interest, first of all, in the classics. Classical education was very, very, very important to the British Empire, especially because it would show the rise and fall of different powers, and that is a constant theme, I say, in British classical education, and indeed in this chapter, so look out for that. And I think it's really interesting. The British Empire is very self-aware that empires have a limited duration, and that they leave a legacy. So this is being written, as I say, well over 100 years ago. First published 1918. So at this point, the British Empire is at almost its apogee, covering about a quarter of the world's landmass. There's more Muslims in the British Empire at this point than there were in any Islamic empire in the history of humanity, just as one example. So it is dominating the world. I think the British fleet was larger than the next two fleets put together, but he is talking about the rise and fall of empires in a very self-aware way. And indeed, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire was written, I believe, in the Georgian era, well before the British Empire reached its maximum extent, but was really an allegory for it. So that's something I really want to draw your attention to, and his interest, as I say, in antiquity. Let's get to it. Let's get to his writing. Cyprus, at the present day, lies in a peaceful backwater, almost out of earshot of the ceaseless hum of the busy world, and removed from the great arteries of commerce along which flows the trade of the world. Rusticus expectat dum defluent amnis, quote from Horace, like a rustic who waits for the river to pass along. Yet in the early days of civilization, Cyprus occupied a vantage ground which was only too readily appreciated by the nations which fought for supremacy all around her, and it is merely the shifting of the centre of gravity of civilizations further west which has left the little island stranded and lonely. Its early history is lost in the mists of antiquity, but the island attained a celebrity all of its own in the annals of mythology. It was from the waves that beat upon the coast of Paphos that Aphrodite, the foam-born goddess, sprang, and although the noble altars erected for her worship have long since vanished from these shores, you shall still see their site to this day. Here he quotes and translates himself Odyssey. So she to Cyprus came, laughter-loving Aphrodite, to Paphos. There she has a shrine and an altar fragrant with incense. So we read in Homer. But long before this, Cyprus was visited by the Phoenicians, who established trading stations on her coasts, and were the first to work the famous copper mines, which are supposed by some to have given the island its name. And before the Phoenicians again, Cyprus had been invaded and conquered by the Egyptians. This event took place in the 15th century before the Christian era, during the reign of Thothmes III of the 18th dynasty, and is the first positive information we possess as to the early history of the island. When we inquire who were the inhabitants found by the Egyptians when they conquered the island, we are confronted by a difficult problem. In the Old Testament, we find frequent references to Kittim or Chittim, and the Jewish historian Josephus identifies this with the island of Cyprus. The ancient Phoenician settlements, which played a great part in the subsequent history of Cyprus, and close to which was built the modern town of Larnaca, was called Kittim or Kitium, and the name survives to this day in the title of the bishop of the diocese. In the 10th chapter of Genesis, we find Kittim mentioned as one of the sons of Javan. We are justified, therefore, in supposing that the race found in the island when the Egyptians invaded it in the 15th century were of Javanian, that is to say, of Ionian origin. This conclusion has been fortified by the discovery in the island of inscriptions in Cyprian characters which bear a striking resemblance to the old Lycaonian script. Its decipherment has proved that this language is of Aryan or Indo-Germanic and not Semitic origin. Examination shows that the words which the Cyprian characters express are much the same as those used by the early Greeks, and we may conclude that it comes from the same parent stock as that of Greece, whether the characters have little or no resemblance to Greek characters, which are usually believed to be of Phoenician origin. We may presume, then, that long before the Egyptian conquest, Cyprus was colonized by settlers of Aryan origin coming from the direction of Phrygia, although we have no guide as to the aborigines whom the settlers displaced or intermarried with. The traces of the Egyptian conquest are scanty, and it seems to have left but little impress on the island. It was probably limited to the payment of tribute and the acknowledgement of dependence. During the reign of Ramesses III, the Cypriots appear to have joined the Phoenicians in an unsuccessful attempt to throw off the yoke of Egypt. But as the years passed, the power of Egypt abroad began to wane, while Phoenicia gradually rose to a position of first importance among the nations. We learn that Hiram, king of Tyre, during the reign of Solomon, made an expedition against Citium, because the colonists of Sidonian origin refused to pay their tribute. Phoenician influence spread rapidly in Cyprus, but about the 4th century before our era, the island was subjected to another tide of colonization which allied itself with and strengthened the native Cyprian element. Settlers arrived from Greece and founded Greek colonies, and these new colonists, unlike the Phoenicians, who maintained intimate intercourse with their mother country, seldom revisited theirs, and became in a short time fused with the Cypriots. The most important and probably the first Greek settlement was on the eastern shores of the island, where a city was founded and given the name of Salamis, the site of which had, however, been occupied by a town of far older origin. Its Greek foundation is commonly ascribed to Teucer after the fall of Troy, and the legend has long survived. Before the Greek colonization, however, the Phoenician influence had been overshadowed by Assyrian, and Cyprus became a tributary to that empire about the beginning of the 7th century before Christ. A statue of Sargon, king of Assyria, cast in bas-relief and bearing an inscription in cuneiform characters, was erected at Citium, and is now to be seen in the Royal Museum at Berlin. Within a century, however, Assyria itself had fallen before the Babylonians, but in 588 BC, a combined fleet of Tyre and Cyprus was defeated by Phoenicius III of Egypt, and Cyprus passed the second time under the yoke of Egypt. The triumph of the latter was short-lived, however, for Nebuchadnezzar, returning into Syria, retook Cyprus from Egypt, and once more the island became a Phoenician dependency until it was again invaded and conquered by Amisis, king of Egypt, who, we are told by Herodotus, took Cyprus, which no man had ever done before, and compelled it to pay him a tribute. At this time there were many Greek settlements in the island, and it is said that Amisis, in an endeavour to win the goodwill of its inhabitants, adorned the temple of Aphrodite with costly offerings. A short time before the Egyptian invasion, Cyprus had been visited at the invitation of Philokrepos, one of the Cypriot princes, by Solon, the Athenian lawgiver, in honour of whom the town of Soli was founded, whose ruins, close to the modern town of Lefka, can be seen today. The dominion of Egypt in Cyprus continued until the reign of Cambyses, king of Persia, the son of Cyrus, about 525 BC, who enlisted the assistance of Cyprus in his struggle against the Egyptians and added the island to the Persian Empire. Thus Cyprus had, in the course of 1,000 stormy years, seen empires wax and wane around her, and had herself been the prey of the conquerors. She had seen the temples of the conquering races set up one by one on her shores, and had been constrained to bow the knee to the Egyptian gods of Isis and Serapis, and the Phoenician Baal, and the Assyrian Melkarth, as each race gained ascendancy. The Ionian colonists had erected their temples to Zeus and Apollo. Small wonder that the island became haunted by mythological shapes, and that the forms of all the gods and goddesses, whose altars littered the shores as the centuries passed, took root in the imagination of the people and coloured the history of the oft-invaded islanders. So far, however, Cyprus had borne a more or less passive part in the welter of nations struggling for supremacy in the lands that surrounded her, although she could hardly fail to imbibe something of the civilization which existed in such close proximity to her shores, in Persia, Phoenicia, Babylonia and Syria to the east, Egypt to the south, Knossos and Mycenae to the west, and Sicilia to the north. She was now destined to take a more active part in the great struggle, which in the end witnessed the defeat of the Persians by the Greeks, and their expulsion from the shores of the Mediterranean. Herodotus gives a very full account of the revolt of the Ionians against Persia in 502 BC, and describes graphically the part taken by Cyprus in this historic contest. The majority of Cypriots sided with the Ionians, who sent a fleet which fought and won off Salamis a decisive naval battle against the Persians and their allies the Phoenicians. But on land the Greek forces, after a few initial successes, were overcome, mainly owing to the treacherous desertion of some of their forces, and the Persians remained masters of the island, having been greatly assisted by the Phoenician towns, which were ready enough to take up arms against the Ionians. The history of Cyprus during these centuries is one of continual conflict between the Greek colonists and the Phoenicians and their masters, the Persians. At one time we find the island assisting Persia against the Greeks with a large fleet. At another, Greek forces land in Cyprus and succeed for a time in wresting a portion of it from the Persians, only to lose it again. We have hitherto referred to the island as if it was one kingdom, but from the earliest time it had been divided into a number of petty, semi-independent principalities, owing a shadowy allegiance to the important kingdom of Salamis. There were probably in the population at this time two dominant elements: one Cyprian, or native, with Greek proclivities, and the other Phoenician, essentially Asiatic. Each had its own peculiar alphabet and language, which figure alone on the coins of the island up to this period. About the year 410 BC, the throne of Salamis, which had been occupied for over a century by a Phoenician dynasty, was seized by one Evagoras, whose ancestors had ruled over Salamis before they were supplanted by the Phoenician dynasty, and who traced his descent from Teucer, son of Telamon, one of the Trojan heroes. Evagoras is one of the most famous characters in the history of Cyprus. He is described as having excelled all his contemporaries in the beauty of his person, the splendour of his martial gifts, and the ardour of his patriotism. Isocrates, the Athenian orator, relates of him that even as a boy he was distinguished among his companions for the strength and address which he displayed in games, and says that all these brilliant qualities were enhanced by kindness of heart, owing to which those who were forced to his own superiority were more than readily won to his side. He seems, in fact, to have been a born ruler, of men. His first care after establishing his rule was to restore the trade between Cyprus and Greece. His next to fortify Salamis, improve the harbours and build ships. He cultivated an ardent friendship with Athens, and many young and eager Athenians flocked to his court. He remained, however, a faithful ally of the Persian king until after the defeat of the Spartan fleet of Cnidus in Caria by the combined Persian and Cyprian force, when he became involved in a war with Persia. After reducing the Phoenician towns in Cyprus, he sailed across to the Syrian coast, reduced Tyre, and excited Syria and Sicilia to open revolt. The Persian king Artaxerxes, becoming alarmed for the safety of his empire, concentrated all of his forces against Evagorus, who had obtained as his ally the king of Egypt, by whom a fleet of 50 vessels was sent to his assistance. A large Persian army landed in Cyprus, and Evagorus retaliated by harassing the Persian communications with his fleet. A naval battle took place off Kition, victory at first inclining to the side of Evagorus, who however was finally defeated and retired crestfallen to his fortification at Salamis, where he was soon besieged by the Persian forces. Here he haughtily refused the terms offered by the Persian general, which were that he should give up all claim to any portion of the island, pay an annual tribute to the king of Persia, and, quote, demean himself towards the latter as a subject to his lord, end quote. Eventually, however, he was forced to conclude a peace by which, whilst paying an annual tribute to Persia, he obtained honourable terms, privileging him, quote, to communicate with the great king as one sovereign to another, end quote. Little less than a year later, Evagorus was seduced into a discreditable intrigue and murdered. Thus died one of the most illustrious men to whom Cyprus ever gave birth, a man whose love of culture, political sagacity, indomitable courage, and energy in misfortune gave him an honourable place in history. After this effort to throw off Persian yoke, Cyprus remained a dependency of that empire until the victories of Alexander the Great finally put an end to Persian dominion, and Cyprus became part of Alexander's vast dominions. On the death of Alexander and the division of his dominions in 323 BC, Cyprus fell to the share of Antigonus, one of his generals, but it was seized by Ptolemy of Egypt and remained under the Ptolemies until the century preceding the Christian era. Its timber, its materials, and its agricultural produce provided Egypt with those much-needed materials, and the island during those 2 centuries and a half enjoyed a period of comparative peace and prosperity under the Egyptian crown, such as it had hardly known before in all its checkered history. It is hardly to be expected, however, that it could succeed in remaining indefinitely outside the boundaries of Imperial Rome, and about 60 years before the Christian era it passed into Roman hands, under circumstances by no means creditable to that great power. The island at that time was in the possession of Ptolemy, known to history as the Cyprian, a man of mean and avaricious character. A Roman tribune, Appius Claudius, fell into the hands of some pirates of Sicilia and applied to Ptolemy for funds to obtain his release. Ptolemy, not daring to refuse his demand altogether, but grudging to part with any of his treasure, sent only 2 talents as ransom. Claudius, indignant at the insult, obtained his relief from his captors on giving his word that he would send the ransom they demanded and hasten to Rome, vowing that he would be revenged on Ptolemy. He persuaded the Roman Senate to pass a decree of confiscation against Ptolemy, basing the claim on a pretended testament of Ptolemy Alexander II of Egypt, and Cato the Younger was ordered to carry out this unjust decree. Unable to resist the will of Rome, Ptolemy consented to cede the island on the condition of his being appointed High Priest of Paphos for life. But before the agreement was carried into effect, unable to bear the disgrace, he poisoned himself, and Cato on arrival took peaceful possession of the island. He proceeded forthwith to convert into money the astonishing quantity of golden vessels, jewels and ornaments, rich furniture and purple robes, which he found in the palaces. To ensure its safe arrival at Rome, he packed it into little boxes, each of which contained 2 talents and 500 drachmas, and was fastened by a rope to a large piece of cork, the whole being valued at some 7,000 talents. To Cato's great credit of the immense treasure in his power, he reserved for himself only a statue of Zeno, the founder of the Stoic school of philosophy, who had been a native of Citium, one of the most celebrated men to whom Cyprus had given birth. The island was made a praetorian province, but was shortly united afterwards with Sicilia to form one proconsular province. Lentulus being appointed in 55 BC as the first proconsul, the latter was shortly afterwards followed by Paphos, who in turn was succeeded in 52 BC by Cicero, whose letters give a vivid account of the state of affairs which he found the island. Paphos, he writes, who has administered a province by fire and sword, who has bled and exhausted it, has consigned it to me, expiring finds it wrong that I should repair the evil which he inflicted. The province under his government has been ruined in every way. Under mine no exactions have been made under any pretext. What could I not say of the prefects of Paphos, of his suite, of his lieutenants, of their spoliations, of their violence, of their brutalities? The Cypriots appear to have welcomed a change which elevated them to the status of Roman citizens. Shortly afterwards they had a brief and illusory semi-independence when their island was presented by Julius Caesar to Cleopatra, who was confirmed in its sovereignty by Mark Antony, but the island reverted to Rome at her death and was divided into 4 districts by Augustus, who bestowed great care on it and rebuilt the temple of Aphrodite at Paphos after it had been destroyed by an earthquake. Christianity was introduced early into Cyprus, and its spread was rapid and considerable. St. Paul landed at Salamis AD 45 in company with Barnabas, who was a native of that town, and traversing the island on foot, converted to Christianity Sergius Paulus, the Roman proconsul at Paphos. Travellers today are shown a marble pillar half buried in the ground to which, the legend asserts, St. Paul was tied and flogged when he first began to preach the new gospel in Paphos. There is no mention of the incident in the New Testament, though it is by no means unlikely that St. Paul suffered in Cyprus one of many scourgings which he enumerates. What is historically certain, however, is that Barnabas suffered martyrdom at Salamis, and a Byzantine church exists to this day close to the site of ancient Salamis, beside which the saint's body is said to have been discovered. The discovery had important results, for it conferred upon the Church of Cyprus a dignity which has been jealously guarded and which survives to this day. When the remains of St. Barnabas were discovered towards the end of the 5th century, a copy of St. Matthew's Gospel in St. Barnabas's own handwriting is said to have been found clasped to his breast. At the time, a fierce ecclesiastical controversy was raging round the Church of Cyprus, whose independence was disputed by the Patriarch of Antioch, who claimed that it formed part of the See of Antioch. The astute leaders of the Church of Cyprus were not slow to appreciate the value of the discovery made in the grave of Barnabas, and they hastened to Constantinople to lay before the emperor their case against Antioch, and incidentally related the discovery of the treasured document. Their astuteness was rewarded. The Emperor Zeno issued a rescript denouncing the claims of Antioch, confirming the Church of Cyprus in its absolute independence, and conferring upon its head peculiar honours which he still enjoys. Among these were the assumption by the Archbishop of Cyprus of purple silk robes, a gold-headed sceptre, the title of beatitude, and the privilege, only customary with the emperors, of signing his name in red ink. On the partition of the Roman Empire in AD 395, the connection of Cyprus with Rome ceased, and it was administered by a proconsul of the Byzantine Empire, appointed from Antioch. The capital was transferred from Paphos to Salamis, which had been renamed Constantia, and the island enjoyed a long period of prosperity till the rise of the Mohammedan power subjected it to a series of Arab invasions. In AD 647, Cyprus was invaded and occupied by Muawiyah, the first Umayyad Caliph, and the Arab conquerors only retained possession for 2 years, when it was regained by the empire. In the following century, during the reign of Nicephorus I, war broke out between the Eastern Empire and the Caliph Harun el-Rashid, the renowned hero of the Arabian Nights entertainments. Cyprus was invaded and pillaged by Arab forces, its churches destroyed, thousands of its inhabitants massacred or sold as slaves, and the remnant subjected to the most oppressive taxation. The island groaned under her Mohammedan oppressors for nearly a century and a half, but it was finally freed during the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Nicephorus II, called Phocas. 963 AD to 969 AD, and enjoyed comparative peace for nearly 2 centuries until, in 1184, one Isaac Comnenus, governor of Tarsus, established himself under the high-sounding title of Emperor of Cyprus and for 7 years ruled the island with great cruelty. It is a curious historical fact that Cyprus was rescued from the tyranny of this rapacious despot by an English king, Richard I, and came for the first, but not as it turned out the last time, under the crown of England. Richard was on his way to the Crusades, and accompanying his fleet was his affianced bride, Berengaria of Navarre, and his sister Joanna, widow of William the Good of Sicily. A storm drove into Cyprus waters, the ships carrying the royal ladies, and they anchored off Limassol. Isaac Comnenus, not content with plundering some vessels of the fleet which had suffered shipwreck on his coasts, proceeded to offer insults to the ladies accompanying the vessels lying in the Limassol anchorage, until the timely arrival of Richard with the remainder of the fleet put a dramatic end to the insolence of the tyrant. Richard landed with a strong force and captured Limassol. 6 days afterwards, in the chapel of the little Gothic fortress which exists to this day, his nuptials with Berengaria were celebrated, his bride being at the same time crowned Queen of the English. Isaac had fled to Nicosia and thence to Famagusta, but he was pursued by Richard, who had been joined by Guy de Lusignan, King of Jerusalem, and the fortress and the island were rapidly reduced, the luckless Isaac eventually surrendering to Richard. By him he was handed over to the Hospitallers, and he died in captivity 3 years later in Syria. Having completed the conquest of the island, Richard left 2 English officials to govern it on the English model, and, just a month after his first landing in Limassol, hove anchor and sailed for Acre. Cyprus was not on this occasion, however, destined to remain for long under British rule. Richard required all his resources and all the money he could raise for his campaign against Saladin, and he found the Knights Templar ready to purchase from him his new conquest. The chaffering which ensued, interesting as an illustration of the manner in which these countries and inhabitants were in those days bartered by petty princelings among each other, ended in the sale of the island by Richard for 100,000 bezants d'or, equivalent in our day to about £320,000 sterling. Before long, however, the Templars, finding it beyond their power to keep in order the somewhat turbulent population, requested Richard to cancel the bargain, and the latter eventually handed it over to Guy de Lusignan as compensation for the loss by him of his kingdom in Jerusalem. For close on 300 years, the island was subjected to the Lusignan dynasty, and these were probably the most brilliant in the history of Cyprus. The period has been thus described in terms which contain in all likelihood little exaggeration. In every aspect of medieval civilization, the little kingdom played a distinguished part. Its remarkable achievements in every domain of human activity invested it with an importance among the nations of Europe wholly out of proportion to its small size and population. Its constitution was the model of that of the medieval feudal state. Its laws, as embodied in the Assize of Jerusalem, a pattern of medieval jurisprudence. It can boast in the Abbey of Bel-Apes, in the cathedrals of Nicosia and Famagusta, and in the castles of St. Hilarion, Buffavento and Cantara, of rarely beautiful examples of medieval architecture. Its men of letters, Philippe of Novaire, Guillaume of Marchut, Philippe de Mézières, occupy no undistinguished place in the realm of literature. In King Peter I, it possessed perhaps the greatest knight-errant the world has ever seen. In his Order of the Sword, the most perfect expression of chivalrous ideas, to kings of Cyprus, such wildly different writers as St. Thomas Aquinas and Boccaccio dedicated works. The wealth and luxury of its citizens, especially in the 14th century, evoked the amazement of all Western visitors. The rich merchants of Famagusta were wont, we were told, to give their daughters on their marriage jewels more precious than those given in France. Admittedly, there was a less attractive side to this efflorescence of French civilizations on the rich Levantine soil. Vastus Gallicus, Syria, Molites, Grace Blanditae, ac Frodus, que unum perlecit in insulum convere, is the epigram by which a contemporary describes the character of the inhabitants of Cyprus in those days, which, as we surely all know, means the pride of the French, the graceful softness of a princess, and frauds which came together in one island. The constant ambition of the Lusinians to recover their ancient heritage in Jerusalem, and countless attempts were made to this end. The Lusinian sovereigns indeed were accustomed to have themselves crowned King of Jerusalem as well as King of Cyprus, and although the hold of the Saracens on the sacred city was never shaken, in AD 1376 Famagusta was wrested from the Lusinian King Pierre II by the Genoese, who ravaged the island and continued to hold it until finally driven out nearly a century later by Jacques II, illegitimate son of a former king. But it was the marriage of the latter with the Venetian lady which brought about the end of the Lusinian dynasty in Cyprus. On his death, followed within a few months by the death of his infant son, the widow assumed the throne. But her sovereignty was nominal, the real power being in the hands of the two Venetian councillors and a provatador appointed by the Republic, and in 1488 the island was occupied by the Venetians as a place d'armes, which was to serve them in their struggles against the Turks. For 82 years Cyprus was in the hands of the Venetians, but they used it merely as a naval and military station, made little attempt, or no attempt, at civil administration. They exhibited little but an insatiable lust for commercial gain, and an overbearing, unsympathetic spirit towards the native population. Traces of their occupation are to be seen in the massive walls of the fortresses at Famagusta and Kyrenia, which remain to this day much as they were in the occupation of the Venetians, by whom they were reconstructed by their former works. Notwithstanding, however, the elaborate fortifications which the Venetians had, with the skill with which they're famous constructed on the island, Cyprus was not destined to resist for long the Turkish war of conquest, which was spreading over Eastern Europe. In 1570, the Turks captured Nicosia after a siege lasting 40 days, and the town was delivered up to the fury and lust of the troops. Young babes, says a chronicler, were violently taken out of the arms of their mothers, virgins were shamefully ravaged, and honest matrons in sight of their husbands despitefully abused. Churches were spoiled, the streets were in all places filled with blood, for in the city on that day were slain 14,800 persons. In the following year, after a heroic defence of 4 months, Famagusta capitulated, its brave defender Bragantino being mutilated and eventually flayed alive in circumstances of brutal barbarity by his ferocious captors. His skin, stuffed with straw and suspended to the yardarm of a galley, was sent to Constantinople, being eventually brought by his sons and carried to Venice, where his remains now rest. The fall of Famagusta decided the fate of Cyprus, and the whole island passed to the Turks. 2 half-hearted attempts to recapture the island ended in failure, and Cyprus remained an integral part of the Turkish Empire until recent times. In spite of the cruelties which marked the capture of Famagusta, the Turks proved themselves better masters than the Venetians, whose military rule had been harsh and exacting. In some respects, indeed, the Turkish pashas proved themselves more liberal-minded than their predecessors. The peasantry were released from serfdom, the Orthodox archbishopric was restored, and the Christian population were allowed a large measure of autonomy. The former prosperity of the island, however, which had begun to decline under Venetian rule, was hardly likely to revive under Turkish administration, and Cyprus gradually sank into a state of barren stagnation, which was destined to last more than 300 years. There are few records of the history of this period. Taxation was heavy, administration light. The peasant was obliged to work ceaselessly, if not particularly industriously, to gain the wherewithal to pay his taxes and to feed himself and his family. There was no incentive to thrift, industry, originality of character, energy, or in short any of those qualities which go to make a virile race. A great part of the land was owned by wealthy Turks, and in the course of time some of this was bequeathed to various religious charities in perpetuo, estates thus being bequeathed, coming under the Mohammedan religious laws, or being administered either by a semi-government department known as EFCAF, or by a mutawalli, or agent specifically appointed for this purpose. A distinguished Italian, the Abbé Maritti, who spent the years from 1760 to 1767 in Cyprus as an official of the Imperial and Tuscan consulates, and credits the island with surpassing every other Greek island in a number of native illustrious for their birth, dignity, learning and saintliness, quoting Strabo's statement in his geography, it yields to no island in excellence, gives an enlightening account of the exactions practiced under Turkish rule. When the governor wishes to impose some tax on the Greek rhea, or subjects, he writes, he does not address himself to the people directly, but to the interpreter, then to the archbishop, who sends notice to the several dioceses to make the most convenient arrangements to avoid annoyances or to lessen the demand. There are few records of the history of this period. Taxation was heavy, administration light. The peasant was obliged to work ceaselessly, if not particularly industriously, to gain the wherewithal to pay his taxes and to feed himself and his family. There was no incentive to thrift, industry, originality of character, energy, or in short, any of those qualities which go to make a virile race. A great part of the land was owned by wealthy Turks, and in course of time some of this was bequeathed to various religious charities in perpetuo. Estates thus bequeathed coming under the Mohammedan religious laws and being administered either by a semi-government department known as Evkaf or by a mutaveli or agent specifically appointed for this purpose. A distinguished Italian, the Abbe Maritti, who spent the years from 1760 to 1767 in Cyprus as an official of the Imperial and Tuscan consulates, credits the island with surpassing every other Greek island in the number of natives illustrious for their birth, dignity, learning, and saintliness. Quoting Strabo's statement in his geography, it yields to no other island in excellence, gives an enlightening account of the exactions practiced under Turkish rule. When the governor wishes to impose some tax on the Greek rhea, or subjects, he writes, he does not address himself to the people directly, but to the interpreter, then to the archbishop, who sends notice to the several dioceses to make the most convenient arrangements to avoid annoyances or to lessen the demand. The poor subjects might very often be saved from oppression if their archbishop were not, from policy and sometimes from personal interest, ready to lend himself to the exactions of the sale. They are often abandoned by the very person who ought to take their part. When the governor wishes to collect money out of season, or of his own mere caprice, the mode of imposing duties and taxes is curious enough. He may even tax with a certain sum anyone who bears a name which he may select, as, for instance, anyone called George has without appeal to pay a certain sum. Such exaction falls on members of the Greek community only, who are treated more as slaves than subjects. That's from Travels in the Island of Cyprus, translated from the Italian of Giovanni Maritti. This passage, incidentally, throws a light on the manner in which the Turkish rulers of the island made use of Greek ecclesiastical authorities in the collection of the taxes imposed by them on the Christian inhabitants, and explains why the archbishop and metropolitans of the Greek Orthodox Church in Cyprus received special consideration from their Turkish masters. The history of Cyprus under Turkish rule can only be regarded, broadly speaking, as a sad record of oppression and misgovernment. The island was more than 2 centuries a mere estate of the Captain Pasha, who was solely concerned in obtaining the largest possible profit out of it. When the complaints of the inhabitants finally reached Constantinople, the administration was taken out of the hands of the Captain Pasha and transformed to Mutazelims, who leased its revenues to the port for the fixed sum of £25,000 per annum. A terrible event occurred in 1825 when the Christian inhabitants were suspected of complicity in the revolution of Greece. The clergy and notables were summoned to a council at Nicosia, and when they assembled the gates were closed, and all invited with few exceptions were treacherously murdered. A reign of terror was thus established, which lasted until the close of the Turkish administration. Reforms were introduced into the island in 1838 during the reign of the liberal Sultan Mahmud II, and the revenues were no longer leased to the Mutazelims. A governor was appointed with a fixed salary, who was charged with the administration and encashment of fixed taxes for the account of the treasury. Later, Cyprus was placed under the valley for the Greek archipelago, whose residence was at the Dardanelles. In 1870, the final change into Turkish administration took place, the island being removed from the vilayet of the archipelago and placed under a mutasarrif responsible directly to Constantinople. Such was the situation when England intervened for the second time in the internal affairs of Cyprus. I shall draw to a close here. That was the second chapter of Cyprus Under British Rule by Charles William James Orr. Knighted and then made a KCNG. It is often said the British imperialists had no interest in the lives of the locals, had no interest in native history, no interest in the real life of the places they lived in. I hope that little reading speaks against that. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.